a stone-lined hole, roughly 8 feet deep, built for under $250. And inside it, a Mennonite family's entire harvest, still fresh, 9 months after the last frost. No electricity, no compressor, no monthly bill. The United States Department of Agriculture actually published the full instructions in 1954. Then they quietly rewrote them. Then they stopped talking about it entirely. That is the part nobody ever explains. And that is exactly where this story starts. There is a small town in Newfoundland called Elliston, population 308, and scattered across its hillsides, cut into the earth like something from another century, are 135 documented underground food storage chambers. The oldest one was built in 1839. It is still in use today. Not as a museum exhibit, not as a heritage display, as a working cellar. The family that uses it has never once replaced a compressor, never paid a refrigeration bill, never called a repair technician. They open the double doors, walk down into the dark, and the temperature inside holds steady, naturally, passively, without any machine doing anything at all. When researchers from Memorial University came to map these structures, one of the students leading the project had never seen a root cellar in her life. She had grown up in Toronto. She spent an entire summer measuring them, recording GPS coordinates, documenting door angles and ventilation placement. 135 chambers in a single town. And nobody had thought to write it down before. That is the first thing that should make you pause. This was not fringe knowledge. It was everywhere. So when did it disappear? And who exactly benefited when it did? Stay with me, because this is where it gets interesting. In 1954, the United States Department of Agriculture published Agriculture Handbook number 66. It was not a dramatic document. It was dry government language, line drawings, temperature charts, humidity tables. It had the kind of title that makes most people put it down immediately. But inside, it was the complete operating manual for exactly what those Elliston families had been doing for over 100 years. Optimal storage temperatures, ventilation geometry, humidity maintenance, the precise conditions that keep food alive without any electricity at all. The USDA knew. They had it documented. They published it. Then in 1966, they issued a follow-up bulletin, Home and Garden Bulletin, number 119. And buried inside that document was a caption that stopped me cold when I first read it. A diagram of an underground storage chamber labeled underground cellar that can also serve as a storm and fallout shelter. The Cold War was real, the threat was real, and the government, in its own published materials, was quietly acknowledging that this ancient hole in the ground was still one of the most reliable food preservation systems a family could have. Then the publication stopped, the updates stopped, the promotion stopped, and the question is, why? Here's the part nobody tells you. The mechanism is almost insultingly simple. Below the frost line, the Earth holds a natural temperature between 32 and 40 degrees Fahrenheit. That range does not require a thermostat, a compressor, or a power grid. It is just physics. It is just ground. Pair that with high humidity, 85 to 95%, maintained naturally by a bare earth or gravel floor, and produce stops shriveling. The 5 variables are earth insulation, a high humidity environment, ventilation with intake low and exhaust high, darkness and drainage. That is the entire system. Carrots, stored properly in one of these chambers, last 8 months. Beets last 10 months. Potatoes last 8 months. Cabbage carries through spring. Winter squash stays good for nearly a year. 0 electricity. 0 refrigerant. 0 monthly cost. The Mennonite communities in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, understood this at a level most people today would find almost unbelievable. German heritage farmsteads there built vaulted stone arch cellars directly beneath their kitchen floors, integrated into the house structure itself, carved and laid by hand. The Hess homestead near Lidditz, an 18th century Mennonite property, still has its original vaulted arch cellar standing. The Mennonite Heritage Center in Harleysville has documented cold cellar food practices from estate inventories going back to the 1700s. These were not improvised solutions. They were engineered traditions, precise ones. The Mennonite cellars even had separate chambers for fruit and root vegetables because long before modern food science could explain it, someone had figured out that apples emit a gas that makes potatoes sprout. They called it knowledge. We would now call it ethylene management. While the rest of rural America was racing to plug in, these communities kept digging, and they kept eating. Then came 1953. That year, Swanson introduced the TV dinner. 10 million trays sold in year one. The following year, a man named Brooks Stevens stood at an advertising conference in Minneapolis and gave a speech that would quietly reshape how Americans related to every object they owned. His definition became doctrine. He called it planned obsolescence, saying, instilling in the buyer the desire to own something a little newer, a little better, a little sooner than is necessary. That phrase entered the American economy like a slow infection. And by 1957, Serval, the last major manufacturer of gas-powered refrigerators, the last real non-electric alternative in the appliance market, had shut down that line entirely. Gone. But here's what I did not understand yet. At Cornell University, a researcher named Robert Smock had spent the 1940s developing something called controlled atmosphere storage. The concept was elegant: seal apples in a low-oxygen environment, slow the ripening process, and extend shelf life dramatically. He published his findings in 1949. His students carried the technology into every major apple-growing region in the country. By 1957, it had reached all of them. It required sealed industrial rooms. It required electricity. It required infrastructure, investment, and ongoing operational cost. The underground cellar required none of those things. So the question that was sitting underneath all of this, the one I kept circling back to, is simple. When the country was standing at that fork in the road, choosing between the system that needed a monthly bill and the one that did not, who was making that choice? And what did they stand to gain? The answer starts at Cornell, but it does not end there. Robert Smock did not set out to bury anything. He was a scientist solving a real problem: how to keep apples from going soft before they reached the market. His 1949 publication on controlled atmosphere storage was legitimate work, careful work, and it spread fast. His students fanned out across New York, Michigan, Washington, the entire Apple Belt, and by the late 1950s, the industrial cold storage model was the default. But here is the detail that matters. Inside the USDA itself, during those same years, there were researchers pushing in the opposite direction, not toward sealed rooms and industrial infrastructure, but toward improved traditional handling, toward better cellar design, better ventilation geometry, and better low-cost passive systems. That division was real. It was documented. It was a genuine fork inside the agency that was supposed to be advising American families on how to feed themselves. And the expensive path won, not because it worked better for the family, because it worked better for the industry, building the rooms, running the electricity, and collecting the bill. This is where it changes. In the 1930s, electric utilities had already begun lobbying aggressively to promote electric refrigerators over gas models, not because electric refrigerators were superior in every application, because electricity meant a recurring monthly payment. Gas was a one-time fill. Electricity was a permanent relationship. By 1925, only 3.2% of American farms had any electrical wiring at all. The Rural Electrification Administration pushed that number to 90% by 1950. That is not an accident. That is a coordinated infrastructure campaign, federally backed, that rewired the country's relationship to food preservation inside of 2 decades. By 1953, 33 million American families owned a refrigerator. By the late 1950s, the number was approaching total saturation. Every one of those families was now paying a monthly bill that had not existed for their parents. And the underground chamber, the one that needed no bill, no serviceman, no replacement part, was not being taught in agricultural extension offices anymore. Not banned, not illegal, just quietly removed from the curriculum, dropped from the conversation, allowed to become the kind of thing only old Mennonite farmers still bothered with, not forgotten by accident, buried on purpose. Now here's the proof object I want you to hold on to. In 1966, 12 years after Agriculture Handbook number 66 first appeared, the USDA issued Home and Garden Bulletin number 119. And printed inside that bulletin, in plain government language with no drama, no caveat, no apology, was this line: you can store vegetables and fruits without refrigeration in basements, cellars, outbuildings, and pits. That is the federal government in an official publication confirming that the system worked, confirming that no electricity was required, confirming that any family with a piece of ground and a weekend of labor could preserve their harvest through winter without spending $1 on power. That document existed, it was printed and distributed, and then it was never meaningfully updated again, never promoted, never pushed into mainstream agricultural education. Meanwhile, by 1959, Americans were spending $2.7 billion annually on frozen food. The average family was now paying an electric bill every single month that had not been part of household budgeting a generation earlier. The chamber that needed no bill was never going to be championed by anyone who collected one. That is not a conspiracy. That is just how systems protect themselves. And the Mennonite communities watched all of it happen and kept digging. Old Order Amish and conservative Mennonite families still use root cellars today. Buried barrels packed in sand, carrots layered in sawdust, separate chambers for apples and root vegetables, because the ethylene rule their great-grandparents learned by observation is still true. These are not hobbyists. These are not preppers running an experiment. These are communities that made a deliberate choice to remain independent of the systems everyone else locked themselves into. And 70 years later, their food is still coming out of the ground in spring, fresh, usable, paid for by nothing but labor and earth. Here's what this means for you right now. The $250 build is real. Fewer than 600 sandbags at under 20 cents each. Barbed wire runs between the courses for structural compression. Rebar framing. A simple ventilation pipe with intake low on the north side and exhaust high on the south. A dirt floor. The design is documented in full in The Doable Off-Grid Homestead, published by Page Street Publishing in 2018. Total material cost, assuming basic tools already on hand, lands between $250 and $400 depending on local prices. What you get in return is 8 to 10 months of produce storage from a modest garden. No electricity cost, no compressor to replace, no monthly line item, just ground and cold, and the same physics that kept a Newfoundland family fed through every winter since 1839. When supply chains seized up in 2020, the people who had built these systems did not stand in empty grocery store aisles wondering what happened. They went outside and opened a door. This is the part that should make you angry. A stone hole. A USDA handbook printed in 1954, a Mennonite barn in Lancaster County, a hillside in Newfoundland with 135 working chambers and one of them pushing 185 years old. This was never fringe knowledge. It was never the eccentric practice of survivalist outliers. It was ordinary. It was documented by the federal government. It was built into the architecture of communities that are still standing. It stopped being ordinary at exactly the moment it stopped being profitable for someone else. That is the whole story. That is the entire thing. You are watching this because you already sense something is wrong with how dependent most people have become. The families who built these chambers were not radicals. They were not preparing for collapse. They were just people who understood that a hole in the ground, done right, was smarter than a monthly bill. That knowledge never actually disappeared. It was in the bulletins. It was in the barns. It was in the hillsides of a town most people have never heard of. You just found it again. Does your property have the space for one of these? Drop the square footage of your yard below, and I will tell you exactly what size chamber makes sense for your setup. And next, I'm going to show you what the Mennonites built inside these cellars, a secondary system, something the USDA referenced once in the early 1970s and then never mentioned again. It is smaller than you think, it costs almost nothing, and it is the reason some of these chambers were keeping food viable long past what the temperature alone can explain. That one is coming next.